We already know about pulmonary circulation. We're talking about the vessels that are going to move deoxygenated blood from the right ventricle, take that off to the lungs, and then return it to the left atrium after the blood has been oxygenated. So the major vessels you need to know are the pulmonary trunk, which are coming out of the right ventricles. That is going to split into the right and left pulmonary arteries. The arteries will branch into smaller and smaller and smaller arteries until you get down to the capillary beds in the lungs. Then that blood will be pulled into venules, which will merge into larger and larger and larger veins until you have the right and left pulmonary veins, which return oxygenated blood to the left atria. Remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and in this case, deoxygenated blood. They are usually carrying oxygenated blood, and veins carry blood towards the heart. Usually they carry deoxygenated blood, except in this instance. Systemic circulation includes the vessels that are going to carry blood from the heart to the bodies and then route it back to the heart. The arterial system starts with the aorta, which is going to be divided into various regions. The short arch, ascending aorta, which merges into the arch of the aorta, which transforms into the descending aorta. In turn, that is divided into two parts, the thoracic aorta, which at the diaphragm changes into the abdominal aorta. The abdominal aorta is going to end at the brim of the pelvic basin. It will branch there into the legs, into the common iliac arteries, one on the right, one on the left. When you are labeling vessels on a test and for all future note-taking on patients, make sure that you label the vessels right or left and add A, capital A or capital V for artery or vein. If you do not label them on any assessment for me, they will be wrong. So make sure you label things right or left, artery or vein. So when we talk about the blood vessels in the periphery, in general, they're going to basically be identical bilaterally, except near the heart. Somewhat like a meandering country road, blood vessels might have different names depending on the location in which you find them, which allows for accurate anatomical descriptions and also allows you to help locate them. So for example, the external iliac artery is now named the femoral artery once it passes the inguinal area. The subclavian arteries are suddenly the axillary arteries, which suddenly turn into the brachial arteries, depending on where you are. Also, we know that anastomoses will exist in order to help prevent damage to tissues if there's an occlusion to a single blood vessel. Now, arteries versus veins. There's a whole list of differences between them anatomically. There will also be a difference between them in terms of vessel distribution. When you talk about where they sit, when you're talking about the extremities and the neck, arteries tend to be deep. They're going to be protected by soft tissues as well as the skeletal system. In terms of veins, there are generally two sets. One will be relatively deep, one set will be relatively superficial. And we know that the superficial blood vessels are going to be important in helping control the temperature of the body, because we know that the superficial veins in cold weather will basically sort of be deep in the body to help conserve heat, and when it's hot out, they will be more superficial in order to allow heat to be lost to air. We talked about that way back when we talked about the integumentary system. The following few slides are lengthy lists of various videos of vessels. So if you have any questions about where they sit, watch these videos. Tons and tons of links. Now, let's talk about the branches of the aorta. The first two branches off the aorta are the right and left coronary artery. You should know that forever, not just for this class. That is how important providing blood supply to the cardiac muscle is. The aorta feeds itself first, or feeds the heart first. Once you reach the branches off the aortic arch, you will see that there is a slight difference. So the very first branch off the aortic arch is the brachiocephalic artery, which is going to divide into the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. And there is a brachiocephalic artery, a single one, allegedly, because there's so much other stuff in that area, two brachiocephalic veins, the right and left subclavian, the subclavian arteries and the right common carotid artery have to pass the trachea, and they have to pass the esophagus, and there's a sternum in there. There's a lot going on in there. So theoretically, or that is the theory that has been proposed, is that there's so much stuff in there, there was a slight evolutionary benefit to having a brachiocephalic trunk. However, when you talk about the blood supply to the left side of the head and the left arm, we have branches that are directly off the aortic arch, which are the left common carotid and left subclavian arteries. The common carotid arteries will divide into the internal and external carotid arteries. Anytime you see that word common when it comes to a blood vessel, there's going to be some sort of either division or merge of an external version of that and an internal version of that. And the left subclavian artery will go off to supply the left upper extremity. So don't panic when you look at this. I know a couple of you were doing so when we were in lecture. Don't, just stop, take a breath, and chunk this down into smaller parts. Oops, hello, go back here. This is a flow chart. So if you want to figure out what's going on with the arm, upper extremity on the left, just take a look at this. This is what you need to know. Left subclavian artery is going to divide or merge into the left axillary artery, which will merge into the left brachial artery. That will divide into the left ulnar and left radial arteries. You have palmar arches here, which are not named, and they will give rise to the digital arteries. So it is not as panic-inducing as you might think. Once you leave that brachiocephalic trunk, you have the exact same pattern, except it's going to be a mirror image because it's on the right. So you have the right subclavian artery, which will give rise to the right axillary artery, which turns into the right brachial artery, which divides into the right and left radial, the right radial and the right ulnar arteries, which, what a surprise, will give rise to the palmar arches on the right hand, which will give rise to the digital arteries. So the pattern on both sides are the same. Just you have to remember right versus left. And you also have to remember the brachiocephalic trunk will give rise to the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. So don't panic, please. Now, we just went over this. Brachiocephalic artery will divide into the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery. Anytime you see common, you're going to have an internal and external version of that. And in this case, the right common carotid artery will branch into the right external carotid artery and the right internal carotid artery. And as we said, the right subclavian artery becomes the right axial artery, which morphs into the right brachial artery, which morphs into the right radial and ulnar arteries down to the palmar arches. Pattern on the right for the right arm and the left arm, once you're talking about the subclavian arteries, is exactly the same. So there are a whole bunch of branches of the thoracic aorta, and the ones that you absolutely positively need to know are the superior phrenic arteries. Why? because they supply the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is a major muscle of respiration. Guess what? If you have superior phrenic arteries, you will also have, sure enough, inferior phrenic arteries. And again, why are they important? Because the phrenic arteries, whether they be superior or inferior, supply the diaphragm, which is a major muscle of respiration. Celiac trunk is a fun little artery. Anytime you hear trunk, you will have a relatively short vessel. Remember the pulmonary trunk that divides into the right and left pulmonary arteries pretty quickly? Sure enough, here's another one, celiac trunk, which is pretty quickly going to divide into the common hepatic artery, important because it supplies the liver. The left gastric artery supplies the stomach, and the splenic artery supplies the spleen. The mesenteric arteries are going to supply the small and large intestine, as well as the pancreas. So anytime you hear mesenteric, think small intestine, large intestine, because there's going to be a membrane known as the mesentery, which we'll talk about when we get to the digestive system, which will cover the intestines. So we need to know about the supraadrenal arteries because they're going to supply the adrenal glands. Renal arteries are super important because you need your kidneys to be healthy and happy and functioning properly. And then the gonadal arteries, which will, of course, supply the ovaries or the testicular area, depending on what gender you are. This shows you the list of arteries and gives you a diagram of where they come off the aorta. And again, don't panic. Just take a look at them and start to look for the patterns and look at the names, and you can pretty much tell what they are going to supply. Now, lower extremity. Remember that the aorta is going to terminate into the right and left common iliac arteries. Anytime you have a common anything, you're going to have an internal and external that's associated with that. So sure enough, the common iliac arteries will give rise to an internal iliac artery, right and left, and an external iliac artery. The external iliac arteries morph into the femoral arteries, which morph into the popliteal arteries, which will give rise to the posterior and anterior tibial arteries. Anterior tibial artery gives rise to dorsalis pedis, which is one of your pulse points, which you need to know forever. Now, the venous system, we know, is all about getting deoxygenated blood back to the heart when you are talking about systemic circulation. And that means that gas exchange has occurred and nutrients have been dropped off and wastes have been collected. Generally, the pathways that we see are going to be parallel to the arteries that supply that region with blood. There are exceptions, and let's go over them. The head will be drained by the external and internal jugular veins. External jugular vein is going to drain the face and scalp. The internal jugular vein is going to drain the brain. They will merge to form the jugular vein. Remember, when you're talking about veins, veins will merge into larger and larger veins. They don't split, they merge because blood is going back to the heart. The median cubital vein is also different. You don't have a median cubital artery. This guy is going to be important because you need to know this forever, not just for this class. It is a site of venipuncture. There are two brachiocephalic veins. The subclavian and jugular veins will merge and give rise to the brachiocephalic vein, one on the right, or one for the right, one for the left. Of course, we have a superior and inferior vena cava, which do not exist in the arterial supply. We have the aorta for distribution of blood instead. We also have the coronary sinus, which is going to drain the cardiac veins. We have the hepatic portal system, which we'll talk more about in a moment. That is going to be hugely important because the liver is a very important organ in so many ways for us. You also need to know about this because it's associated with the digestive system, so you'll see it twice. Now, the great saphenous vein is the longest vein in the body. It is found in the lower extremity. It extends from the medial aspect of the ankle up to the external iliac vein. This guy is important for, anybody remember? Bypass surgery. And as you know, it gets put in backwards. And you need to remember why that happens, why it's put in backwards if it's used for bypass. And again, we have the inferior vena cava. That will begin at the same area where the abdominal aorta terminates. It is the largest vein draining the lower part of the body and the lower extremities. Now, our friend the hepatic portal system, es muy importante. It's going to drain the gastric, mesenteric, and splenic areas. So it's going to be pulling blood out of the spleen, out of the intestines, large and small, and the stomach. Those veins do not drain directly into the inferior vena cava. They travel to the liver through the hepatic portal vein. And that is because the liver processes the blood that comes out of those organs and does various things with them, like detoxifies them, like processes the nutrients that have been pulled out of the small intestine and creates things like plasma proteins or immunoglobulins or carbohydrates that you need, or stores glucose, or does exciting things with the lipids, which we'll talk more about when we get to the digestive system. Can't wait, but fun. Now, this gives you a pathway if you are tracing a drop of blood from the right ear or from the right finger off to the right ear, or at least from the right finger off to the right atrium, to the right ventricle, off to the lungs for oxygenation. And then what happens to get the blood to the ear? Make sure that you can do that.